Bruce, thank you for joining me today on Chain Reaction.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
So let me launch right into the first question. We're talking about Central Asia today, and we've talked before, you and I, about the increased external power or great power interest in the region. So, who are these great powers that are suddenly interested in Central Asia, or maybe not suddenly? Maybe they have been for a long time. But it's a lot more in the news and in the policy analysis world now. So, who are these great powers that are interested in Central Asia, and what do they want there?
Well, first, I suppose I should start by saying that, traditionally in the last 10, 20 years anyway, it's really been Russia and China that have been involved in Central Asia for obvious reasons. I mean, they're the neighbors, right? So, and they're big powers. They had everything that the Central Asians were looking for, whether it was security, financing, whatever. So they've really been the ones. To a slightly lesser extent, the European Union, which has been a big partner of Central Asia. But, once Russia launched its full-scale war in Ukraine in late February 2022, um, it changed a lot of things for the Central Asians, and really for the way that trade and the infrastructure and everything in Central Asia worked. Suddenly, the northern route through Russia, which is the one the Central Asians have traditionally used, why wouldn't they? I mean, the first railroads that were built in Central Asia were built in Tsarist Russian times. All the roads led to Moscow. So all of a sudden, that was not going to work. The traditional ties, the relations they had with everyone along these routes that went through Russia and over into Europe were all of a sudden tenuous after all these years. So it forced the Central Asians to rethink how they were going to move goods to conduct trade. And for a lot of other countries, there was an opportunity here. There was a lot of countries that have been, I hate to say on the fringe or on the margins or something, but they weren't, obviously, they didn't have the geostrategic positioning of China and Russia to engage with Central Asia, but they were there. So one, you had Turkey, for instance, right? Turkey is a guy. There's cultural and linguistic affinities to most of the people in Central Asia, Kazakhs, Kyrgyz, Turkmen, and Uzbeks. Turkey had always had good ties with Central Asia, but not really strong ties. So this is now they have a chance not only to get in good with the Turkic peoples of Central Asia, but they've made advances. For instance, the Turkish foreign minister is in Tajikistan today and will be in Kyrgyzstan tomorrow. So they've established good ties with them, but Turkey never really had an opportunity to certainly to squeeze in between Russia and China as far as Central Asia. So that's one country that saw an advantage. I can detail a little bit more about that maybe later in the show. But anyway, for their purposes, the trade corridors through Central Asia were all of a sudden much more attractive. They were one of the countries that used to get a lot of their things from Central Asia via Russia by truck, usually. So now all of a sudden they had a chance to take another look at the Caspian Sea, the Caucasus, their friends, the Azerbaijanis, and figure out if they couldn't use some of these new infrastructure projects they already had, the Baku Tbilisi Kars Railway, for instance, to start moving goods. So they're one. They moved in. And like I said, hope I'll get to them, I'm sure, in a little while. But I want to get all the countries in here. Now, the Arab world has always had a connection to Central Asia. In ancient times, pre-Russian times, certainly, the Arab world in Central Asia were pretty tightly connected, as tightly as you can be over those great land distances. But still, there was, places like Bukhara are revered even in places like Saudi Arabia, which is many kilometers, many miles away, and have been for hundreds and hundreds of years. So the Arabs were always had some business ties with Central Asia, but they've also upped their game noticeably since Russia's invasion. So they're another one I would put in there. Really even South Korea and Japan, who are another two other players who have always been engaged with Central Asia quietly for the most part with them, but they've really started to make much more advanced, much greater advances into Central Asia and really shored up their ties, strengthened their ties with Central Asia since then. And then, of course, we got the West. The U.S. and the European Union have also seen that this is an opportunity to get the Central Asians more independent from Russia after all this time. They don't need to push the Central Asians too much to get them to go along with that for sure. But the U.S. and the European Union have come back. Obviously, both have had substantial presences in Central Asia in the past. And I mentioned the European Union is actually one of the leading trade partners of most of the Central Asian countries. So and the United States, of course, that was there for 20 years because of the campaign in Afghanistan. So they also have had a presence. But post February 2022, they also saw opportunities to come in and bring the level of cooperation with the Central Asian states up to some new height, which has been pretty successful.
Let me ask you this, specifically with respect to the U.S. As you said, we were a fairly large presence in Central Asia from right after 9/11 until, when we had the bases in Tashkent, Uzbekistan, and Manas, Kyrgyzstan. Then we closed those. When Enduring Freedom officially ended at the end of 2014, our presence declined, and then of course it declined precipitously when Afghanistan fell in 2021. So, with the renewed U.S. interest in Central Asia, what would you caution the U.S. about the region, and what caution would you issue to leaders in the region about the U.S.?
Well, the one I would caution the U.S. of is that strangely, the U.S. is it's almost in a repeat position of where it was when they first started using the bases you mentioned when they first started to establish a presence in Central Asia post 9/11. Was that well, the Central Asians had a new importance as a partner. And at first the Central Asians didn't seem to perceive it. You got to remember they'd only been independent 10 years when this happened, right? So, here's the United States, clearly the only superpower in the world at the time that wants to be even better friends with Central Asia, and not only that, but relieve them of their huge security problem with Afghanistan, which they were spending a lot of money and time on prior to 9/11. So the U.S. showed up, but then the Central Asians kind of got understood that they had leverage that they didn't have before too. Undoubtedly, they were coached in some of this by the friends in the Kremlin quietly, who pointed out that the U.S. needed them now, and so they didn't have to do everything the United States told them to do, because they could say, as Karimov later did, threaten to just pull up everything and say, "Get out. We're not going to be part of this your Afghan operation anymore. You can't put troops on the ground. You can't move goods through our country." And now we're kind of back there again. You mentioned that, of course, the U.S. image had fallen precipitously after August 2021, when Taliban returned to power in Afghanistan. I would also argue, or at least mention that for the older politicians in Central Asia, they understood that the U.S. had provided a shield for them for 20 years from what was happening. I mean, I've made the argument before that very few countries benefited from the U.S. presence in Afghanistan as much as the Central Asian countries did, because again, they had a domestic Islamic terrorist group problem, and that group was connected with the Taliban. The Taliban were always threatening them, except for Turkmenistan. All of them were on bad terms with the Taliban, and Uzbekistan and Tajikistan had actively worked with groups in Afghanistan to fight against the Taliban, right? So the fact that and this had gone on for 3 or 4 years. So the fact that the U.S. came in and practically overnight removed that threat entirely was a big plus for the Central Asians. It made them a more attractive trade partner because the security problem was alleviated. But past that, because of the U.S. presence and the foreign presence in Afghanistan and the infrastructure projects they did, it connected Central Asia to Afghanistan in ways that it had never been connected before. Thinking about electricity exports, and Central Asia accounts for more than 70% of Afghanistan's electricity imports. So, roads, railways, things that had never worked, that had never been there before, were all built. And so there was new economic possibilities that just simply weren't there prior to 9/11. So but anyway, to get back to your point, once the Central Asians started to realize that the U.S. needed them, then they didn't have to listen to what was happening. And you can see Andijan, for instance, in May 2005, was really a watershed moment, because there was a massacre out there. The Uzbek government troops had used excessive force, would be putting it mildly, and the U.S., of course, had to say there should be an international investigation into exactly what happened here. And that's what led to the U.S. getting kicked out of Hanabad Karshi, of course, urged by the Chinese and Russians, who told them they should set a timetable. But in any case, that's what led to the Uzbek government asking the Americans to leave. All the Central Asians saw that and understood that they could also at least resist some of the things that Washington was telling them to do. The fact that America had to go back and repair its relations with Uzbekistan even cemented that among the Central Asians. So they understood that not only could they challenge something that the U.S. was telling them to do, but that the U.S. would come back anyway. If there was no other choice, they would have to come back. And I think that's kind of what the situation, in some ways, there's echoes of that with what's happening now. The U.S. wants to help them firm up their sovereignty and territorial integrity, which is great. A lot of threatening messages coming out of Moscow and other places in Russia from Russian officials, admittedly, not huge high level officials, although Putin did talk about historic Russian lands and Russia considering all the territory of the former Soviet Union to really be Russian historic land. There have been some officials in Russia that have specifically named countries, Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan more recently. So, it's good to have a country like America, which is still the military superpower of the world, as a friend, so that you can at least like make the Kremlin pause a little bit and consider carefully some of its statements that it makes about what's happening in Central Asia's future and what Russia and Central Asia's future are. So that's good. But at the same time, I think at this point, partially because so many players are coming into Central Asia, the U.S. is in a much poorer position to influence the domestic policies of the Central Asian governments. You can tell them to observe human rights, to hold free and fair elections, things like that. But at the end of the day, when they don't do that, there's nothing you can do about it because the Central Asians will turn to China, Russia, the Arab states, Turkey, and some other countries too for support, and they'll get that support.
Let me give you maybe an impossible assignment, and that is in 2 minutes or less, describe the nature of the Russian-Chinese relationship in Central Asia today.
It's sometimes there's a convergence of interests. Security, for instance, but it's in both Russia and China's interest that there's stable the situation and political situation in Central Asia is stable. They don't want Islamic militants. They don't want something like Iraq or Afghanistan or something breaking out on both their doorsteps. So that's one thing. I think Russia's a little resentful of the fact that China has always been able to make inroads by using money. Now, after that, it gets a lot more difficult to see where they really have common interests. China has made its influence felt in Central Asia through financing, and China still has vast finances it can use for Central Asia. And what really it represents pocket change for China too, right? $600 million project. If you're Kyrgyzstan or Tajikistan, that's huge investment money. That's not so much for China, right? So Russia can't do that anymore. They haven't been able to do that for almost 20 years now, where they just don't have that kind of money. Post 2008, anyway, they've never been able to do that. So, and because they're tied up in Ukraine, they are also no longer seen as the security guarantor in Central Asia too. There's a lot of questions about what that means. All the time until February 2022, the Central Asians were counting on the fact that if things got really bad, they could just call Moscow and say, "Please send everybody you can and help us out." But now, when they see what's happening in Ukraine and the poor performance of the Russian military, there's a lot of questions about how good that help is going to be if they need it and if it will even come. Right now Russia's bogged down, so it makes sense to be with China. I think the Russians are resentful that the Chinese can keep doing this. They can fund all this stuff. They do, joint military exercises sometimes and police exercises, and they provide money to the armies and the police and security structures of Central Asia, supply them with computer technology, all kinds of things that the Russians simply can't do anymore. So this is a problem.
So interesting. You mentioned that February 2022 is an inflection point, and that prior to then, Russia had been seen as a security guarantor and would come in and sort of bail out the Central Asian governments if they had internal problems. You remember a month before February 2022, they did exactly that in Kazakhstan, where Russia led a collective security treaty organization intervention to stop the violent protests that had broken out there. So, and I think you're spot on to mention the fall in Russia's power and influence and reputation as a security guarantor in the region since the invasion of Ukraine. So I guess last question about external powers or great powers. Who's the big winner from that? Who's the big winner from Russia, the collapse of Russia's influence and power in Central Asia?
Well, I would say the Central Asians first and foremost. And why is that true? Because they have again, they have this whole new group of partners, people they've known, but they weren't that close to, that all of a sudden are showing up. I had mentioned Turkey, and this is where Turkey comes in, right? Russia, when there were doubts about Russia's role as a security guarantor in Central Asia, almost all of the Central Asian states turned to Turkey right away. They had seen what had happened with Azerbaijan using Turkish drones in Nagorno-Karabakh, right, in 2020. So they understood that Turkey was Turkey was resurgent. Turkey, I suppose I should say. Turkey was resurgent. And that they were actually they were becoming more of a military power than they had been in very many years. So certainly the Turkic states of Central Asia turned to Turkey for new security agreements and new defense contracts, which they all filled. And it was fortuitous that right before that, of course, Erdogan had taken an organization which had kind of lumbered along for years of Turkic states, and made it a more defined organization, and renamed it the Organization of Turkic States, which had a charter and a security component and an economic component. It had previously been a kind of a cultural talk shop. It brought in Kyrgyzstan, Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Azerbaijan, and Turkey, with Turkmenistan as an observer nation. But just using that as a vehicle post February 2022, Turkey was able to come right into Central Asia and give them security guarantees and equipment that compensated for the loss of faith, and also the loss of supplies from the Russian military in Central Asia. So that's one. In terms of financing too, because we also know, I'll go fast, because we know that I had mentioned that China had been providing all these finances to Central Asia, and several of them anyway, are deeply in debt to China because of that. Their external debt, 30-40% of it, Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan, I'm really talking about, belongs to China. But all of a sudden, when the Arab nations stepped up, they also provide some military hardware too to the Central Asians, but they have the money. So now Russia can't provide any money at all, and they don't want to take any more money from China if they don't have to. And here comes a new potential source anyway, of financing and investment for Central Asia, which has actually been proven very successful in the last nearly 2 years, where they have gotten a lot of money from the Arab world. So these are the kind of guarantees that Central Asia didn't have before, that they suddenly have post February 2022.
Bruce, I like that you started out answering that question about who's the big winner by saying the Central Asian governments themselves, right? Because I think so often we see this region and maybe many other regions as sort of arenas or playgrounds for great power competition, and forget that these are states with agency and interest of their own, and they're often able to play the great powers off of each other to protect or advance their own interests. So how are the Central Asian governments reacting to their increased stature and the increased interest of great powers in the region?
Well, I mean, for them, this is, I hate to say it's like Christmas. It just seems inappropriate since they're all Muslim countries. But, if I could back up just a little bit, obviously, no one practically knew where Central Asia was until 9/11. And even then, when they got that, obviously they're grateful. Now they got Western attention, right? And CNN, BBC, everyone's showing up to find out these mysterious exotic countries, north of Afghanistan. And so that brought them an attention that they'd never, international attention they'd never had before. But in fact, at the end of the day, that was because they were just partnering with the United States and NATO countries, right? So that's where all the attention was coming from. Now, with these possible new trade routes that they're hoping to open up, with the resources that Central Asia has that are still relatively untapped, with some of the potential they have for developing their own domestic industries with an eye toward exporting some of that stuff abroad. There's a lot of things that come in here that all of a sudden everyone, because Russia had left a vacuum, everyone saw that there was an opportunity for them somewhere in some of all those things I just mentioned. To give you an example, I've been talking about trade corridors, and I know we're going to get to that in a minute, but when all of a sudden the Central Asians are rethinking their trade routes through Russia, the Arab world would love to have trade routes that went from China through Central Asia and went through either probably Iran, of course, or somehow through Turkey, and then got to the Middle East. It's a much shorter route. So they've shown up, right? Which is great for the Central Asians. Yeah, they don't have the money to build these railways, to make sure that they have very modern roads so that they can ship stuff back and forth. I mean, most of them are stretched for financing. So here come these countries from the Arab world that see this opportunity. They're invested in ports on the Caspian Sea, in Kazakhstan, Azerbaijan, and in Turkmenistan. They're helping out with the railway system. Qatar just said it would build the railway between Uzbekistan and Pakistan through Afghanistan, for example. But more generally, to keep it with the Arab world and bringing that's one example of them seeing that there's an opportunity to open a trade route through Central Asia, which benefits them. But at the same time, this benefits Central Asia. They can ship their own goods through that too. So they get that. Everyone wants to help them with security. all of a sudden now that instead of using Russian weapons, which have proven to be not so effective in Ukraine, they're getting offers from, like I mentioned, Turkey, the Arab states, and even China too. And of course they're couching this as, Russia's made threats against your sovereignty and territorial integrity. This will help you ensure that they cannot just walk in and take over your country as they've done in the past. So they get that kind of guarantee. Everyone wants to help with investment, and I would be remiss if I did not say something about climate change too, because Central Asia is kind of a test case. It's of now of what you can do to alleviate the effects of climate change. They're suffering from it very badly at the moment. This is clearly one of the worst hit areas in the world right now. So it benefits everyone on the planet to help them out and try to figure and to see what will work. What technology can you bring there that will mitigate the effects of climate change and be able to keep areas sustainable for human habitation for a long time into this looming crisis that we got. So you get the infrastructure investment that's coming there. You get the security help that you want, and you're getting help with climate change. So if you're the Central Asian governments, you practically have to be an octopus to take everything that people are offering you at the moment. I mean, they're getting offers from all over the place. In the past, like I said, not post 9/11 when the U.S. and NATO showed up, they got great offers from them, which was fantastic. Better cooperation with Europe, better cooperation with America, but that was really it, right? Now it's everybody. That's saying we want this, we want that, we want to buy, uranium from Kazakhstan. So again, Kazakhstan is the leading producer of uranium, some of the biggest reserves of uranium in the world. How do you get that to your market if everyone's trying to go green and people are thinking about shifting to nuclear? This is the place you want to go. But how are you going to get exactly this uranium that you want? Well, first you invest to develop the uranium industry in Kazakhstan, which is already fairly developed. Then you need the infrastructure to ship it out. So you can see how the chain of investment works along the way. Not only investment in the production at the site for your resource, oil, natural gas, whatever, but the better infrastructure investment, gas pipelines, roads, railways, shipping across the Caspian, so that you can get this product that you want. Malaysia, you got it all, right? You don't have to spend hardly any of your own money, and your potential to trade is going up exponentially.
Hey, Bruce, it was interesting. You started out that answer by talking about 20 years ago, post 9/11, how there was an increased interest and attention to the region, especially in part of the Western media, right? That places that most Americans had never heard of were suddenly on CNN pretty routinely. And of course, that turned out to be a double edged sword, right? Because along with that increased interest and attention came exposure, I guess, by Western media of the fact that these were pretty authoritarian, anti democratic regimes, and also put the U.S. in the position of having to defend, for instance, why it had signed a strategic partnership agreement with Uzbekistan, which you mentioned the Andijan massacre in May of 2005. Of course, the strategic partnership sort of culminated there, right, and fell apart over that, among other things. So I guess the question is, you've written recently, and you and I have talked about the fact that the Central Asian governments, some of them, are using this second round of increased great power interest to become more authoritarian at home. So how does this end? Are we in for a redux of 20 years ago where eventually there's so much scrutiny of their domestic records that the great powers lose interest? Or are they going to be able to negotiate it more successfully this time and I guess be democratic enough at home to maintain the interests at least of the U.S. and EU?
Yeah, this is a good question. We're certainly in a different situation than we were 20 years ago. For the West, I think this is a very difficult situation for them. With certainly, Central Asia will always have a geostrategic importance for a lot of countries, and absolutely for the West. When you're north of Iran and Afghanistan, and west of China and south of Russia, a lot of things, as we've already seen, with 9/11, you can't just forget about these places in the interior. I mean, no one would have thought that a group of people in Afghanistan would be able to plot an attack, on the United States of America. But we've seen that can happen. So you do have to keep track of what's going on in Central Asia. It's in the West's interest that Central Asia becomes more independent from Russia in the long term. It's also in the West's interest that Central Asia does not change that Russian dependence for exchange the Russian dependence for a Chinese dependence too. Now you want to add the second layer, which is if you are a country that is getting something, and this is really the Europeans, if you are a trade partner with Central Asia for something important. I mentioned uranium, but they've been talking about the Caspian, Trans-Caspian gas pipeline for years. Maybe that'll happen one day. Europe, a lot of the oil that Europe is getting is actually comes from Kazakhstan, right? So these things you still need to get from them. So it's always going to make those countries important. Now, for the Central Asians, you do want to keep a partnership with the West. For one thing, they pay on time and they pay some of the biggest prices, right? So this makes them a good trade partner, and a reliable trade partner too. Whereas some of the other ones, maybe not so much. So that's one reason why the Central Asians will always want to have a good relationship with the West. And to be fair, I mean they do lip service. I mean it's hard to say to be fair, but I mean they do hold elections and they do. Right, they do refer to their own constitutions when it's convenient, and how they have these beautiful things written on them that defend basic human rights and democratic freedoms. So they are at least acknowledging, by that they're acknowledging that they understand the West concern. The problem is for the West, that because Central Asia has so many partners, that they can ignore the West anytime they want. So it's really, you're right. It's where the West ranks Central Asia in terms of priorities. I would argue that it's always worth it to keep engaged with them because you never know what's going to happen out there, and it's an important. It is the crossroads of the Eurasian continent. On the other hand, what is the West's interest in being deeper engagement in Central Asia? There's no way that we're going to arm the Central Asians because of their human rights record. Right? That's not going to happen. They'll never get Western weapons. We'll never get huge Western investment, certainly not huge U.S. investment, because what does the U.S. get back from that? It's literally on the other side of the world. You can if you're France or Germany and you want uranium, that's fine. If you're the United States, you can turn to Austria, Canada, or they're right there. So there is no importance in having Central Asia as a trade partner for those, oil, uranium, things like that. And actually, I've said in a couple of times, in some of the worst cases in Central Asia, it's probably worth it to just cast them or bring relations down to a bare minimum. Tajikistan's one that I can think of. I really don't see, what the interest is. Say the U.S. or maybe the European Union less so, but certainly what is the U.S. interest in Tajikistan now that we're not involved in Afghanistan anymore? As an monitoring outpost for what's happening in Afghanistan, maybe, but otherwise, there's not many U.S. interests there, and it would send a message to just cut ties down to a minimum and say that we're doing this because of your abysmal human rights record. Now, as far as the deteriorating situation, and I'll try to get through this real quick because you mentioned that the Central Asians how they're becoming more authoritarian since they've gotten all this attention. I'm going to use Kyrgyzstan as an example. It's the most extreme example, but here's a country that was for years in the 90s called the island of democracy in Central Asia. It's always been mentioned as having the most democratic system of all the Central Asian states, and yet during this time when the U.S. and other Western nations are becoming closer to the Kyrgyz government, again, Kyrgyzstan has gone from being the island of democracy to being the lost city of Atlantis, practically, as far as that goes, because it's the things that made Kyrgyzstan more democratic were vibrant civil society, an active and genuine political opposition, and an independent media. And all three of those things have been picked away. They're functioning on a very low level. Kyrgyzstan was famous for having protests almost all the time. Almost every week there was somebody out there protesting for wages, housing, more money, political rights, individual rights, things like that. It stopped entirely because this government has terrorized them. And yet, this is a country that everyone's happy to, see the leader of. When the Western officials meet with them, they don't criticize the government really too much, and they kind of let them go because there is an understanding that criticizing them will push them into the other camp, I suppose, or other camps. It's strangely reminiscent of what happened in the 60s and 50s with the U.S. certainly, where the most important thing was that a government was anti-communist. Now after that, it could be one of the worst dictatorships in the world. But the point was that everyone was dividing themselves into who was an ally and who was the enemy, and a lot of the allies were very unsavory countries, unsavory governments.
Yeah, that's a great point. Over the long run, right, that turned out to be probably not the best decision to put aside sort of the ideational, moral, ethical qualms in the interest of confronting what we saw as monolithic, aggressive communism, right? So, I mean, we did some things that didn't reflect over the long term well on us and our commitment to the sort of universal values that are in every national security strategy we've ever published, right? So let me switch from geopolitics now to geoeconomics. And you mentioned this earlier, but I want to come back to it and let you talk about it a little more. So, what's the middle corridor, and why is everybody suddenly talking about
Well, the middle corridor is actually a combination of several different projects that have been going on for more than 20 years now. Again, Central Asia was kind of it was isolated. It had been certainly under Russian rule for since the latter half of the 19th century, and in some cases in Kazakhstan, even going back into the 18th century. So, I had said all the roads led through Moscow. There was attempts starting in the very very late 1990s to try to get Central Asia better connected, even to its own neighbors. Right, China. There was a railway they had started to build in the 50s that they'd stopped between Kazakhstan and China. But there was no road or railway connecting Kazakhstan and China, or any of the other Central Asian states that border China to China. I mean, it had been actually fenced off, right? It was Soviet Union and China in those days, and so you got to start connecting China and Central Asia. But I think I give credit to the Asian Development Bank for being the ones to start this. They had the Central Asia Regional Economic Cooperation Program, CAREC, and that's the one. There's 6 CAREC corridors, but they took the inner Asian states and devised these network of roads, railways, plane, anything they could, all modes of transportation, to connect them better together. It included all the Central Asian states. It included the Caucasus, the western part of China, Mongolia, Afghanistan. So, and the idea was to get them better connected so they could trade better. And also some of the power projects. I mentioned the electricity. That was also part of this, CASA 1000, things like that. So they were one. The U.S. comes in at post 9/11. They also are starting to develop trade networks using, or at least developing the existing trade infrastructure networks. Later on, they were using the Northern Distribution Network, which was actually railways that went through the Caucasus and then boat across the Caspian, and then originally it was Russia, where goods were coming from NATO to Central Asia and down into Afghanistan via Russia by rail. That deal went south. So later on, when the Northern Distribution Network, then it was across the Caucasus, across the Caspian, through Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan and into Afghanistan. So that route was developed too, leading there. China's Belt and Road, of course, the road networks that I had mentioned, railway networks, they started connecting themselves to the Central Asian neighbors with early on in the 90s. They developed that, and I would actually argue that was the prototype and the idea for the Belt and Road Initiative. Most of that work was done in the first decade of this century, and it wasn't until 2012, 2013, when Xi Jinping shows up in Kazakhstan and talks about the Belt and Road Initiative. But all those roads and railways that are now part of the Belt and Road Initiative were already in Central Asia, and they saw what could be done and understood how you could just carry that out and expand it. So you have Belt and Road, you have CAREC, you have what the U.S. has done, a bunch of other projects, the smaller ones, Lapis Lazuli, Trans-Caspian International Trade Route, and all those melt together into the middle corridor. So what the middle corridor gives you is all these routes that go from East Asia through Central Asia and across the Caspian and over to Europe, down to Turkey, and now down into the Middle East. And you also ended up with the parts of the infrastructure that were built that connected Central Asia with Afghanistan. And although those don't look so they'll be very promising as lucrative trade routes, I mean, it's worth mentioning that for the first time you can take a truck, you can ship goods by truck from Uzbekistan to Pakistan through Afghanistan. And I'd mentioned earlier that Qatar said it had built this railway that they've been talking about for the last few years that would connect Uzbekistan to Pakistan and Pakistan's railway network through Afghanistan. And of course, if they can connect to Pakistan's internal domestic railway network, then they have the option of being on the Arabian Sea and the Indian Ocean. So it could expand trade if the political situation is right with India, and certainly with China, I suppose, from southeastern China. The middle corridor is like 5 different previous projects that they all brought together and said, boom, mentioned again with the Russian route compromised and complicated. That this is why the middle corridor all of a sudden you'd said why after 20, why now, and that's the reason because all of a sudden the Russian route is unreliable, and the people are thinking that the best way to get goods between China and Europe is actually this middle corridor, as opposed to having to worry about the headaches and problems of going through Russia.
Right, because of the sanctions, right? And that's one of the big reasons the middle corridor has emerged as a potentially viable route is that it's less risky than going through Russia because of
And I have to mention at this point because I'm actually going to write this paper for somebody. Is that with what's happening in the Red Sea, the middle corridor has also got that really bumped up. It should be bumping up their image, and that's exactly what I'm going to write. Is the fact that we already the middle corridor got popular because because of what's happening with Russia and the sanctions and everything. But now, if you look at people rediverting their shipping from through the Suez Canal and going around the Cape of Good Hope instead, and adding 10, 11 days to the trip. Obviously, the volumes is the problem. You can't replace the volumes from a ship. But if you're looking to get something in a guaranteed 20-day time period, the middle corridor is looking better than even the southern corridor all of a sudden. So
yeah, no, that's true. I hadn't put two and two together on the Red Sea and the attacks on shipping and all that. But yeah, I mean there are several things sort of converging to make the middle corridor a more attractive route, right? And of course, not only Central Asia, but the Caucasus countries and Turkey are happy about that because it puts them on the
yeah, and Turkey certainly needs the money. Anything. I'd always argued, and I don't say this to Central Asians very much, but I really always thought that that's Central Asia's future. People are like, oh, they got oil, they got gas. I'm like, these are finite commodities. They will be at the rate that they're producing them. They will be out by the end of the century. But their true potential in the future is transit fees from being that corridor, at the center of the Eurasian continent. That's where they're guaranteed to get money. So that's
yeah,
really the thing that they should always have been trying to work on and boost. They're just fortunate that now they don't have to pay for it. Part of
yeah.
their thinking that one day will be important enough that they'll come and build it for us, but in any case, it certainly worked. That now everyone, like I said, the Arabs, the Turks, the Europeans, the Chinese, everyone's just like, yes, we'll help build the middle corridor. Here's money, and we're sending people and companies over to help you do it. And if you're Central Asia, you're going, great.
Come on
Yeah,
in.
I'm in. Sounds good to me.
Bruce, that's great. So thanks so much. Really, this is a region that, as we have talked about, is emerging or re-emerging in the minds and the policies and the strategies of a lot of people in the EU and the EUS. Right, we're rediscovering the importance geopolitically and geoeconomically of Central Asia, and there's really nobody better positioned or better qualified to explain why than you. So I really appreciate you joining me today on Chain Reaction, and I enjoyed the conversation.
No, thank you. I love talking shop. Thank you very much.